At 2 a.m., the main hospital in Ouagadougou went completely dark, not because of technical failure, but because a fuel truck from Togo never made it. The border was blocked. The price of oil had tripled overnight. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, Israel moved to blockade a key global oil strait, cutting off one of the world's main arteries of energy. They called it a security measure. But African children do not breathe in the language of diplomacy. Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso, didn't need a UN emergency session to understand what was happening. He knew today's war doesn't begin with bombs, but with banking directives and oil prices. Don't mistake silence for peace. Don't mistake restraint for weakness. And never believe that small nations will remain silent forever. Africa was once torn open by the blade of conquest, its resources stolen, its children enslaved on their own soil. That pain cannot be forgotten. Yet, from the ashes, faith in God still burns. Share this video so the world hears our cry, turned into a vow. Africa will rise and reclaim everything. The announcement came just after midnight. Israel had closed the Strait, one of the most vital oil routes in the world. No ships would pass, no fuel would move, no consultation, no warning. Within 6 hours, oil prices soared past $150 a barrel. Stock markets froze. Emergency meetings were called in Brussels, Washington, and Geneva. But there was no emergency declared in Ouagadougou. No aid was rushed, no headlines screamed, just silence. Yet the silence carried weight. Because in that silence, diesel vanished from Burkina Faso's rural clinics. Generators stopped humming in schoolhouses, and at a small farm outside Kaya, a mother buried her last harvest of millet, too dry to sell, too poor to replace. The oil wasn't stolen by soldiers. It was priced out of reach by suits behind soundproof walls, and the theft felt familiar. Africa knows this feeling too well. For centuries, her lands have bled gold, diamond, copper, cobalt, only to be told she is indebted. Her rivers have carried timber, cocoa, and bauxite, only to be fed back processed goods at 10 times the price. Her oil found in Nigeria, Angola, Ghana has powered cities that mock her poverty with glowing lights. We produce, they profit, we suffer. That's the cycle. And now, with one strategic blockade, the cycle spun faster. The West didn't scramble to produce more fuel. They scrambled for control. And where did their maps point? To nations like Burkina Faso, underdeveloped, undersecured, untapped. But untapped by whom? In secret briefings, resource reports were circulated like war plans. Potential reserves, untapped wells, weak governance. The same phrases used before the first gunship landed in Congo, before the first IMF loan paralyzed Ghana, before the first aid mission became a mining contract. This time they didn't send armies, they sent instability. Suddenly Burkina Faso was volatile. Suddenly anonymous attacks emerged near energy corridors. Suddenly headlines spoke of rising extremism, while backroom deals sought access to underground wealth. But the soil remembers. It remembers being scraped, sold, and shamed. It remembers the day uranium left Niger, while Nigerians sat in darkness. It remembers how a continent so rich could be starved into silence. And Traoré he remembered too. He stood before the press and spoke not just as a president, but as a son of the continent. Don't call this a fuel crisis. Call it what it is, weaponized economics. We are not collateral damage. We are the primary target because we refuse to kneel. His voice was steady, but the pain was deep. This wasn't just about oil. This was about dignity, about who gets to live with light and who must live in the shadow of someone else's empire. The blockade showed the truth that in a world ruled by scarcity, Africa's abundance is a threat, not because she cannot lead, but because if she does, the old order must fall. So they call her dangerous, unstable, unready, and they raise fuel prices not just to punish Iran, but to pressure every nation that dares to dream independently. But what they forget is this: you can't blockade a spirit, you can't embargo memory, you can't price out a people who have already paid in blood, sweat, and centuries of silence. It began with a rumor, a whisper in an international forum, a leaked report from a European think tank, a satellite scan shared in a closed-door session. Burkina Faso holds more than gold. New geological readings show promise, minimal resistance, political uncertainty, great potential. That's how the war started, not with tanks, not with sanctions, but with whispers. Then came the NGOs. They arrived overnight, fluent in the language of aid, funded by names the public never hears. They promised training health media support. But with each training came strange questions. Who are the local leaders who's loyal to Traoré, who can be influenced? Burkina Faso was being surveyed, not by geologists but by strategists, not by doctors but by operators. Suddenly, local journalists who spoke of sovereignty found themselves deplatformed. University grants vanished. Farm cooperatives that refused foreign deals were audited, then shut. Then came the fires, first near Fad and Gourma, then in the north. No group claimed responsibility. No trail could be followed, just smoke, panic, and the growing idea that the country is unstable. But unstable for whom villagers whispered, "We used to see armed men. Now we see drones overhead. Trucks marked medical aid, but no clinic ever opens." In the capital, Ibrahim Traoré began to connect the dots. He wasn't paranoid, he was precise. He saw how war had changed. It no longer announced itself, it infiltrated. It funded the enemy and denied the victim. It controlled the narrative before the first bullet was fired. And the narrative now said Burkina Faso was dangerous. Its leadership erratic, its president untested, all code words, all dog whistles for intervention. The same language they used before they crippled Libya, before they stabilized Mali, before they signed security partnerships that led to coups. The West didn't need military bases this time. They needed one thing: access to the land, to the energy, to the silence. But Traoré refused silence. He expelled questionable NGOs. He froze suspicious accounts. He banned certain media syndicates. He called out diplomats by name in press conferences. He declared, "Burkina Faso is not a marketplace. We are not for lease. If your only interest in us is what lies beneath our soil, then you are not a friend." And with those words, the map changed. Burkina Faso went from potential partner to rising threat. Funding dried up. International banks stalled payments. Supplies vanished at customs. And foreign embassies quietly advised citizens to leave. Not because there was war, but because there was resistance. That's when the psychological war began. Anonymous voices online began blaming Traoré for food shortages, though he didn't control the ports. Western outlets ran stories of authoritarian drift, though he was never elected to be a puppet. He was being isolated, not because he failed, but because he refused to fail the way they needed him to. Meanwhile, in cities like Paris and London, Burkina Faso returned to the briefing slides. Not as a humanitarian crisis, but as a logistical opportunity. Access routes, export corridors, friendly intermediaries. The quiet war had found its next battlefield. No bullets, no bodies, just algorithms, debt, and destabilization. And amid it all, Traoré stood in front of the African Union and asked a question no one expected. When will Africa stop being the continent of compromise? How much more must we give before we're allowed to live? The room was silent. Not because they disagreed, but because they were afraid. Burkina Faso was becoming a symbol, not of chaos, but of what happens when a small nation says no. And so they made it look chaotic. They distorted his words, misquoted his policies, magnified his errors, and ignored his achievements. But the people knew. In the rural fields, farmers whispered, He speaks for us. In the mosques and churches, prayers were said for his protection. In the diaspora, the youth began sharing videos, stories, hashtags. And still, the pressure came. Burkina Faso was being surrounded by silence that screamed, submit or collapse. But Traoré held the line. And now we must ask you, the viewer, the listener, the descendant of a continent that refuses to be erased, if your country were being mapped not for its people but for its potential plunder, what would you do? If foreign hands tried to write your future in invisible ink, would you hand them the pen? When all else is taken, the fuel, the funds, the freedom to speak what remains. For Ibrahim Traoré, only one weapon stood untouched: truth. They called him inexperienced. He responded with clarity. They called him unstable. He answered with structure. They called him dangerous. He countered with transparency. In a world where headlines lie and silence buys compliance, truth is revolutionary. And Traoré chose to speak, not behind closed doors, not in coded reports. He stood before microphones and named names. They call it aid. But what does aid look like when it funds your enemies? They call it partnership. But what kind of partner locks your reserves and opens your borders to theft? His voice wasn't raised in anger. It was sharpened by history. He reminded the world of Thomas Sankara, the young revolutionary who paid the price for telling his people they were already rich. Of Patrice Lumumba, murdered for believing Africa could own its minerals. Of Muammar Gaddafi, demonized for dreaming of a gold-backed African currency. Traoré knew the pattern. Speak too loudly and they call you radical. Speak too clearly and they call you dictator. Speak too honestly and they make you disappear. But he spoke anyway. He knew silence was more dangerous than defamation. So he moved quickly, not with violence, but with vision. He restructured the military not to expand power, but to end infiltration. He purged ranks of commanders known to attend foreign-funded training seminars. He encrypted national intelligence networks, cutting them off from backdoor servers tied to old colonizers. He took on the media, not with censorship, but with clarity. State television no longer echoed international headlines. It aired maps of stolen lands, stories of stolen futures. Young journalists were trained to investigate IMF contracts, not just rebel attacks. Traoré launched what he called the Sovereignty Curriculum, a national education program focused on African history, indigenous science, and economic self-reliance. If they erase your memory, they can rewrite your mission. But if you teach your children the truth, no one can enslave them again. He spoke in churches and mosques, on university steps. And then he did the unthinkable. He asked Africa to choose. He proposed a regional resource alliance, an energy-sharing network across West Africa that would redirect oil, gas, and solar flows away from foreign contracts and into intra-African distribution. He froze ongoing mining deals that lacked transparency. He invited neighboring nations to audit Burkina Faso's natural contracts and offered to do the same in return. If we cannot trust each other, we will be forced to trust those who have never honored us. Some called it naive, some called it suicide, but others called it possible. Mali responded first, then Niger, then Guinea. Leaders from across the Sahel began meeting off-camera, in homes, in farms, in desert camps. They didn't come with entourages, they came with questions. And for the first time in decades, Africa was not asking the West for answers, it was asking itself. Yet as hope rose, so did retaliation. The World Bank downgraded Burkina Faso's investment profile. Reuters ran a headline: "Strongman President Destabilizes Region." Suddenly fuel shipments were delayed. Medical supplies lost in transit. The economy was not attacked with bombs. It was throttled with bureaucracy. But Traoré had expected this. He had already launched barter systems between local farmers and urban markets, bypassing foreign-controlled currency. He had quietly negotiated with Eastern partners for backup trade routes. He had even prepared an emergency fuel reserve, hidden local renewable. because he knew they weren't fighting his policies. They were fighting his possibility. The possibility that a young African without Western schooling, without colonial approval, could lead without apology. The possibility that truth spoken in the language of ancestors could cut deeper than drones. So he stood again. In a broadcast watched by millions in Africa, in the diaspora, even in the silence of boardrooms, he said, "You have taken our gold. You have taken our diamonds. You have taken our leaders. But you will not take our voice," and he meant it. Because by now, the voice was not his alone. In Ghana, students wore his image. In Brazil, Afro-descendant communities quoted his speeches. In Chicago, African-American churches prayed not just for peace, but for Traoré's protection. He had become more than a leader. He had become a mirror reflecting back everything they were never supposed to see, a continent awakening, a people remembering, a generation refusing to be quiet. And in that reflection, a question formed, not just for presidents, but for you. If truth became the most dangerous weapon in the world, would you still dare to speak it? Something is changing in Africa, not on the surface where headlines still scream of poverty and war, but underground, in the quiet hum of cross-border meetings, in WhatsApp threads between ministers, in voices rising from the villages. It began with Captain Ibrahim Traoré. While the world saw a blockade, he saw a blueprint. Where others saw crisis, Captain Ibrahim Traoré saw a continent ready to rewrite the rules. And so he moved not alone, but deliberately. He reached out to Mali, to Guinea, to Niger, not with weapons, but with a question. What if we stopped surviving and started strategizing? For too long, Africa had been reactive, waiting for loans, waiting for trade, waiting for permission. Captain Ibrahim Traoré refused to wait. He invited neighboring leaders to a private summit off-grid, off-script. No translators, no Western observers, just Africans talking to Africans. They didn't come to sign memorandums. They came to speak freely about everything they were never allowed to say in Davos. The result, the birth of a counter-alliance. A coalition of small, defiant nations refusing to be labeled unstable for choosing dignity. And at the center stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, not as a commander, but as a compass. He didn't ask them to follow, he asked them to remember that Africa once traded gold for salt, not debt for dependence. That Africa once taught the world math, medicine, and metallurgy before it was told it was developing. He helped launch the Sahel Sovereignty Fund, a regional pool of resources to support local infrastructure without foreign strings attached. He helped coordinate energy redirection agreements, routing excess solar from Niger to power clinics in Mali, exchanging agricultural surpluses between Burkina Faso and Guinea. Most importantly, Captain Ibrahim Traoré helped rewrite the idea of leadership. He didn't come in suits. He came in uniform not as a show of force, but as a reminder that his loyalty was to the people, not to protocol. Everywhere he went, children ran toward him. Mothers gave blessings, elders wept, because Captain Ibrahim Traoré wasn't just leading a government. He was embodying a memory, the memory of Africa before division, before extraction, before humiliation. International media called it posturing, but the streets called it restoration. They painted his face on walls, wrote his quotes on shirts, recited his speeches in classrooms, and he didn't stop there. Captain Ibrahim Traoré initiated the Pan-African Resource Audit, a voluntary shared database of mining and oil contracts across member states, exposing decades of theft and unfair royalties. He opened Burkina Faso's state archives to other African nations, revealing how post-independence leaders were manipulated, blackmailed, or killed for trying to stand alone. And in every meeting, every address, every public square, Captain Ibrahim Traoré repeated one phrase: "We do not seek revenge. We seek release from every chain disguised as a partnership." This message found fertile ground. In Tanzania, students formed clubs named after him. In South Africa, truckers printed his face on windshields. In the Caribbean, musicians sampled his speeches. The diaspora was no longer watching, they were responding. Donations poured into local development cooperatives, aligned with the Counter-Alliance. Engineers returned from Europe to build solar grids. Doctors offered pro bono service in neglected provinces. It was no longer about Captain Ibrahim Traoré as a man, but what he stood for: a return to self-respect, a refusal to apologize for defending what was stolen. But the siege didn't end. New sanctions came, new warnings from the UN, new attempts to fracture the alliance. And yet Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood. Because now he wasn't holding the line alone. He had built a continental firewall made not of walls but of will. At the African Union he declared, "If you consider us poor, then leave us alone in our poverty. But if you know our worth, stop trying to own it." That speech, 7 minutes no notes, was watched over 20 million times. And in a single week, 5 new African nations asked to join the resource audit. 4 reversed their privatization contracts. 2 expelled questionable foreign advisors. The ripple became a wave. Captain Ibrahim Traoré became more than a name. He became a signal that silence was no longer strategy. And with that signal, something impossible began to form: a new Africa. One not defined by victimhood, but by vision. One not trapped in aid cycles, but building internal circuits of trust and trade. One not apologizing, but awakening. And the world watched afraid. Not because Captain Ibrahim Traoré was dangerous, but because he proved that sovereignty is contagious. He proved that you don't need empires to rise. You only need the courage to stop kneeling. The story of Captain Ibrahim Traoré's stand against global exploitation is not just a tale of one nation's struggle. It is a blueprint for a continent reclaiming its soul. At its heart lies a lesson more urgent than ever. In a world engineered to silence the weak, dignity is revolutionary, and sovereignty is non-negotiable. Burkina Faso's quiet defiance reveals how 21st century wars are not fought with bombs, but with banking blockades and bureaucracy. The oil crisis triggered by geopolitical tension in the Middle East did not hit all nations equally. For African countries like Burkina Faso, whose economies are deeply entangled with Western-controlled supply chains, the blockade was a death sentence. Hospitals went dark, crops failed, and no emergency summits were held for them. The West did not send aid, it sent silence. This silence was not accidental, it was strategic. Captain Ibrahim Traoré understood this. He saw that behind every drone, every delay at customs, and every suspicious aid mission, there was a larger game being played, a game where Africa was always the playing field, never the player. His response was not merely administrative, but philosophical. He challenged the foundational lie that Africa needs saving, when in truth it needs release. His lesson: that dependence is not inevitable, it is manufactured. Throughout the story, we witness how economic sabotage was used as a weapon, anonymous attacks delayed shipments, and algorithmic defamation were orchestrated not to protect the world order, but to preserve it. Western powers did not fear Traoré's incompetence. They feared his competence. They feared that his clarity, his refusal to kneel, might spread. And it did. In his speeches, Traoré reminded us that Africa's resources have always enriched others, while impoverishing its own people. Gold from Ghana, diamonds from Congo, oil from Nigeria, all fueling skyscrapers elsewhere, while African children learn under trees. He reminded us that colonialism never ended. It simply changed its accent. But he didn't stop at diagnosis. He offered remedy. By expelling foreign NGOs that were instruments of surveillance, by freezing accounts tied to destabilization, and by launching local economic systems insulated from foreign currencies, Traoré did more than resist, he rebuilt. He saw that sovereignty was not just political, it was educational, economic, and cultural. His sovereignty curriculum was one of the most visionary moves of his presidency. To teach African children their own history, their own sciences, and their own worth, this was not nostalgia, it was strategy, because memory, when reclaimed, becomes a weapon against manipulation. Traoré also dared to ask a fundamental question at the African Union. How much more must we give before we're allowed to live? This was not rhetorical, it was revolutionary. For the first time in recent history, African leaders were no longer gathering to negotiate their survival, but to design their future. His proposal for a regional energy-sharing alliance across West Africa was not merely logistical, it was ideological. It symbolized a break from centuries of externally dictated trade routes. It said we will trade with each other before we trade our dignity to outsiders. This too had consequences. Western media labeled him authoritarian. Financial institutions downgraded Burkina Faso's credit. Fuel was delayed, medicine was misplaced. The resistance had no army, but it had spreadsheets, headlines, and interest rates. And yet Traoré stood, because in his words, they are not fighting my policies. They are fighting my possibility. That is the deepest lesson of this story. The lesson that courage in Africa is not punished because it is chaotic, but because it is coherent. That leadership rooted in ancestral truth, not colonial approval, is perceived as a threat. That once a people remember their worth, the global economy built on their silence begins to shake. What Traoré symbolizes is not perfection, but permission. He gave Africans permission to imagine sovereignty as more than a slogan. He made it a system. He invited engineers, teachers, and the diaspora into the work of self-determination. In Brazil and South Africa and the Caribbean, his speeches became soundtracks of awakening. His image traveled not as propaganda, but as prophecy. He reminded people that dignity is not given, it is declared and enforced. Through barter economies, encrypted intelligence networks, and a pan-African resource audit, he showed that Africa doesn't lack capacity. It lacks protection from those who fear its capacity. So what do we learn? We learn that war is no longer declared. It is disguised. We learn that development without dignity is just extraction in disguise. We learn that to be truly independent, Africa must first unlearn the dependence it was taught to normalize. But above all, we learn that a leader can be more than a ruler. A leader can be a mirror, a compass, a call to memory. Captain Ibrahim Traoré taught us that Africa's future will not be bought, it will be built. And if truth is now the most dangerous weapon in the world, then may this generation be brave enough to wield it. Because as Traoré said, if you know our worth, stop trying to own it. And perhaps that is the final indelible lesson. Africa's silence is over. Its voice is rising, and its sovereignty is no longer up for debate. I am an African, not a president, not a diplomat, not a professor. I am a farmer from Ghana, a student in Dakar, a miner in Congo, a nurse in Bamako. And when I heard the story of Captain Ibrahim Traoré and the quiet defiance of Burkina Faso, I didn't just see a political event, I saw myself. I saw a mirror reflecting our shared pain, our stolen voice, and our buried strength. For years we've been taught to survive in silence. That silence was safer. That silence was the price of stability. That if we just followed instructions, accepted aid, and lowered our gaze, we might be left alone. But Traoré changed that. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't plead for help. He didn't speak in the polished tones of global diplomacy. He spoke plainly, in our language, to us. And when he said Burkina Faso is not a marketplace, if your only interest in us is what lies beneath our soil, then you are not a friend. I felt something I hadn't felt in years, dignity. He wasn't loud, but he was unshakable. For the first time in my life, I saw an African leader, not trying to impress the West, but trying to awaken Africa. He wasn't offering excuses. He was offering memory. He wasn't pointing fingers. He was pointing forward. When oil prices skyrocketed and hospitals lost power, the world said nothing. When food shortages hit our villages, there were no breaking news headlines. But Traoré saw the game. He understood that modern war isn't about guns anymore. It's about economic warfare. And he had the courage to call it by its name. He said, "Don't call this a fuel crisis. Call it what it is, weaponized economics." And suddenly I realized we've all been under siege. Our crops, our currencies, our children's futures, held hostage by systems we didn't design. But what made Traoré different wasn't just that he resisted. It was that he remembered. He remembered how we were taught to forget. Forget Sankara, forget Lumumba, forget that Africa once led the world in knowledge, trade, and power. Forget that our lands were rich long before our pockets were emptied. And so Traoré fought back, not with tanks, but with truth. He expelled foreign NGOs acting as spies, froze suspicious accounts, blocked media syndicates that twisted our stories. He trained young journalists to investigate financial crimes, not just follow rebel attacks. He launched the sovereignty curriculum to teach African children who they were before colonization, before debt, before dependence. And nobody began to believe again. Believe that maybe our suffering wasn't a curse, it was engineered. Believe that sovereignty is not a gift from empires, it's a decision. Believe that if one African can say no, then maybe millions of us can say enough. Traoré didn't just make speeches. He asked real questions, dangerous questions. What if we stopped surviving and started strategizing? He didn't wait for global summits. He called secret meetings with Mali, Guinea, and Niger. No translators, no Western eyes, just African leaders speaking freely. For once, we weren't asking the world what it thought of us. We were asking ourselves what we believed in, and what came from those meetings, not aid packages, not handouts, but action, barter systems to bypass foreign-controlled currencies, solar energy agreements, a Pan-African resource audit, a sovereignty fund, real tools to protect our dignity without begging for permission. But of course the backlash came. Media called him a strongman. Banks froze transactions. Sanctions were whispered. Supplies were lost in transit. Algorithms were weaponized. Traoré was painted as erratic, extreme, dangerous. But I knew better. Because in every village I visited, people whispered his name with hope. In mosques and churches, elders prayed for his safety. In universities, students quoted his speeches like gospel. And across the diaspora from Chicago to Cape Town, his face was no longer just a face. It was a signal that Africa's silence was ending. They fear him, not because he's violent, but because he's clear. Because he reminded us that the most powerful weapon in the world isn't an army. It's truth. And truth when spoken by the oppressed shakes empires. Traoré stood before the African Union and said, "If you consider us poor, then leave us alone in our poverty. But if you know our worth, stop trying to own it." That wasn't a speech. That was a declaration. And I, an ordinary African, felt it like thunder in my bones. He doesn't wear fancy suits. He doesn't speak in code. He doesn't ask for applause. He simply refuses to kneel. That is why they fear him. Because if he succeeds even a little, then everything they told us is impossible becomes possible. A continent that trades with itself. A generation that studies its own history. A people that stop apologizing for surviving. And so I ask you, wherever you are reading this, not as a spectator, but as a fellow human being, if your nation was being mapped not for its people, but for its profit, what would you do? If every headline about your country was twisted, every truth deleted, every resource stolen, would you still stay silent? I won't. Because I've heard Traoré speak, and now I will never unhear the truth. Africa is not rising. Africa is awakening. The fire that Captain Ibrahim Traoré has lit in Burkina Faso is not a solitary flame. It is spreading across the continent like a sunrise that can no longer be delayed. For those of us who have watched our nations silenced, misrepresented, and plundered in the name of development, his defiance is not just political, it is personal. You see, for too long, Africa's children have been taught to admire those who oppressed us, to speak languages that were once forced upon us and to doubt our own capacity. We were told that dignity was a luxury, that sovereignty was unrealistic, that global cooperation meant surrendering our land, our voice, our future. But Traoré stood on a global stage and said, "No more." His voice reminded me that we are not developing, we are rediscovering, we are not unstable, we are unchained, and we are not behind. We are being held back by systems, by narratives, by those who profit from our fragmentation. He called out the charade of foreign aid that funds our enemies' aid, that demands silence aid, that arrives with conditions and leaves with ownership. He reminded us that every time we export raw gold and import processed debt, we are trading sovereignty for survival. Yet his vision goes beyond resistance. He's building a new foundation, one rooted in trust between African nations, not through performative summits, but through tangible alliances, shared energy-audited contracts, and mutual defense against economic sabotage. And we, the people, are responding. In South Africa, I see truck drivers with Traoré's portrait on their windshields, not because they know every detail of Burkina Faso's politics, but because they recognize something real, a leader who fights for them without ever having met them. In Tanzania, students gather not for protests, but for purpose, to study Africa's stolen wealth, to map a future without apologies. In Nigeria, community leaders are asking new questions. If Burkina Faso can defy the IMF, why can't we? This is the shift, not just of policy but of psychology. We are no longer asking for permission, we are asserting our place. And though the road is hard, though sanctions bite and headlines lie, we have seen what's possible when just one leader chooses principle over profit, memory over convenience, truth over comfort. So to the world that watches in fear, calling him dangerous, yes, Traoré is dangerous. He is dangerous to empires that require Africa's silence. He is dangerous to those who think Africans can be bought. He is dangerous to a system built on forgetting, because now we remember. We remember Sankara, we remember Lumumba, and most of all, we remember who we are.